All right, I think we'll give it just a couple more minutes. I know some people are, it looks like we're getting a longer attendee list minute by minute here. So Rita, you are now a co-host. All right, well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. So this is our first meeting of the CI working group for this academic year, and we're thrilled to have Dr. McGrath on the line, who is going to talk through her book, Seeing Around Corners, and kind of discuss CI with us. And so she'll go ahead and do a presentation, and then we'll have, you know, a little bit of time for open discussion. And so with that, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. McGrath.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate that. All right, that tense technology moment where you're seeing if it all works. So, okay, so you should be able to see my screen now, can you?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Okay. So what I thought would be of interest to your group is really this whole idea from the book of how do I create an early warning system, and how do I create the ability to kind of literally see around corners. And I thought just a couple of these techniques might be of use to you. And so I'll maybe talk for 10 or 15 minutes, and then we can use the rest of our time for discussion, which I think would be fun. So the first observation I would make is that many of the ideas we used to think about in strategy, this notion of a sustainable competitive advantage, the idea that you got this advantage in place and you could just exploit it for a long period of time, that those ideas really are a lot less useful in more and more parts of our economy. Now, there are still places where, because we've had very limited antitrust enforcement, or we've got network effects creating these pseudo monopolies, those places are pretty well defended. But in a lot of parts of our economy, advantages are just getting shorter and shorter. And so I think against that context is the way that I think about strategic inflection points. It's those moments when things really change. And so just to illustrate this is a picture of market share shifts in the gaming business. And, in the beginning, there was arcade games, and that was all there was. You had to go to a physical place and throw money into this analog refrigerator-sized machine. And it was only open during working hours, and that wasn't really very convenient. But the next big inflection point in that sector came when you started to be able to separate out the software from the hardware. And that opened up whole new sets of opportunities in, Apple II gaming and the Commodore 64s and those kind of things. Then we started to have experimentation around form factors. So you started to have smaller games that could go with you, that could be portable, that you could play anytime. And of course, today we've got games, on phones, in the air, all around us. We even talk about other kinds of processes being gamified to keep people attentive. And what matters here is the pattern, which is that from a strategy perspective, you've got this period where an advantage is created. That's the innovation process, broadly writ. Then you've got a period where you launch it and get it into the market. And then, the inevitable happens, things change. So customers get bored, technology shifts, something happens in the environment that causes your previous advantage to be less and less powerful. So that brings me to the idea of strategic inflection points. And this was first introduced by Andy Grove back in the 90s. And he wrote a wonderful book called Only the Paranoid Survive about Intel going through one of these major sort of inflection point changes. And the way I define an inflection point is it's something that shifts, typically in the external environment, that has a 10x effect on your business. And what's interesting about that is it also shows why we so often miss them before they're sort of obvious to everybody. It's because they take a long time. As the famous writer Ernest Hemingway said in The Sun Also Rises, one character asks another, well, how did you go bankrupt? And the answer was, well, gradually, and then suddenly. So too with strategic inflection points. They often bubble up, ages before anybody really sees them. And that, I think, is the opportunity, which is if you can see them early, your business can take on to new heights. And if you miss them, if you wait too late, your business declines. Now, the reason people so often miss strategic inflection points, and I think we can certainly talk about higher ed in this context, is that over time, you develop a way of doing business, a business model, if you will. And there are certain very, very predictable elements of that model, because what you're doing, is you're replicating a success. So you hone out all the variation, you get rid of all the different kinds of change, you learn what your KPIs are, you learn how to make things move. And over time, that starts to become the lens through which you see the world. And the problem with that is when something changes that's outside the perspective of that lens, it can be really easy to miss. For instance, if I'd said to you 10 years ago, oh my God, YouTube, it's going to completely change the media equation. It's going to undermine Metro Goldwyn Mayer. It's going to take on the advertising. I mean, this is going to be huge. You would have kind of looked at me and said, Rita, YouTube is cat videos. You are aware of that, right? And if you think about it, a lot of YouTube still is cat videos. But what it did was it had this huge changing effect on what's possible, and to the point where two kids in a garage today can make a living making YouTube videos. It's pretty interesting. So that's the nature of an inflection point. So the way that I like to think about developing early warnings really begins with an observation that the kind of data we have to work with actually falls into three buckets with respect to how useful the data are. So the first bucket is lagging indicators, right? Great information, it's already happened. We can't really change those things. Second bucket is what I call current indicators. That's what's going on right now. And so if you think about, things like net promoter score or employee engagement might be current indicators. They're telling you what's the state at the moment. Then you've got leading indicators. And leading indicators have some very interesting properties. The first problem is that they're often qualitative. They're data about something that hasn't happened yet. So the criteria you don't want to put on a leading indicator is, did it predict what was going to happen? Because what you really want with a leading indicator is, did it help us prepare? Were we prepared when the inflection point goes through? And that's really the question that you want to ask. So a great example of this is, back in the 90s, a bunch of these computer scientists said, oh my God, computer systems all over the world have been programmed with only 2 digits as the year. And come the year 2000, the change of the millennium, they're going to be fooled. They're going to think it's 1900. And this is going to be bad. Airplanes are going to drop out of the sky. And, nuclear plants are going to become unstable. And we should all move to Montana and stockpile wheat. I mean, that was how dire these predictions were. So the big moment comes, midnight, the end of 1999, 2000 springs upon the scene. What happened? Nothing happened. Why did nothing happen? We saw the early warnings. The stories were frightening enough that we actually invested billions in what they called Y2K compliance, because the vividness of what could happen, what could go wrong, was really impressed in people's brains. So that's an example of a leading indicator. So how do we find leading indicators? And this leads me to the early warnings model, which really says, okay, if you think about the strength of a signal, the information you have to go on that something is going to be happening, it's very weak at first, then it gets stronger and stronger, and eventually at what I call time zero, you've got facts, you've got data, you can analyze it, you can take pictures. And the problem is that there's always this other line, right, that you got to deal with, which is your degrees of strategic freedom are inversely related to the strength of the signal that you have to work on. And that's a perennial problem for the strategists. By the time you have the information that you would have liked to have to make a decent decision, the moment has passed and you can't do anything about it. So what we're looking for is a way of moving our optimal decision-making framework backward in time to what I call the period of optimal warning. And not too early when it's still very, very weak. And you really can't say with any confidence that there's a pattern yet. Not too late, so you can't take action. And that's what we're really looking for. So here's how I do it. I define a time zero event. And the way I do it is I pick 2 major uncertainties. And you can pick as many as you like. Working with 2 is a good place to start. Then you assign different future values to each, and create a 2x2, and then tell a story about that possible future situation. And so just for purposes of keeping it current and showing you how it might work in real life, I'm going to say uncertainty number one is we're basically sticking with the maximizing shareholder value concept, not so much in our rhetoric, but in our practice, or not. And uncertainty number two is, the world economy. It bounces back, or maybe it doesn't. So what we can do then is we can say, okay, if those are the future time zero events, these are the possible stories that we could come up with. So let's take the first column, which is we're still maximizing shareholder value and we have a prolonged global slowdown. That's a pretty grim place because it's going to be Les Miserables. We still have a few people with enormous amounts of resources, whereas the bulk of people have insecurity, lots of competition for resources. And we're already, seeing political instability in many countries. We're seeing real kind of emerging tensions. And we know that future scenario is a very unstable one. So that's something that, should be of concern. Then let's say the economy comes back, but we're still kind of devoting the bulk of our corporate resources to shareholders and executives and investors. It's kind of a rinse and repeat of what we've been doing and very little sort of shifting. That's kind of the scenario that's probably closest to what we've got today. On the kind of stakeholder capitalism side, let's say this crisis actually does prompt calls for a new social contract, but we continue to have really slow economic times. That to me is almost a repeat of the Great Depression, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt's sort of call for expanded safety net programs. The government will provide employment for people that the private sector can't. And, you might even see appropriation of wealth, people saying, hey, look, all that money locked up in the Cayman Islands, we have better uses for it. And then, of course, the most pleasant scenario for many of us would be we see a rewriting of the social contract and the economy bounces back. Now, I think I should say one important point here, which is that it's very important not to mix up your preferences with your predictions. Like I could tell you what scenario I'd prefer, but that doesn't mean these others aren't entirely possible. And we want to really open our minds to them, even if they're not particularly pleasant. So then to get your time zero event, what you do is you say, write a headline, right? And so just going around the 2x2, first situation is, why economic inequality leads to collapse. Not very pleasant, but we can't rule that out, right? Then second headline, extreme poverty returns to America. Third headline, echo of FDR's rendezvous with destiny speech, officials turn to government programs and taxation to combat economic tyranny. And the last scenario, kind of Great Society 2.0. And right now where we're sitting, and what is it now? It's September 1st, 2020, any of those are possible and various variants of them, right? So when you're thinking about your strategy now, how robust is your strategy given what these futures might hold? So then this is what kind of brings it all together. What we do is we say, okay, take our time zero event, and now we're going to work backward. We're going to ask the question, what would have to be true? What would we have to be able to observe if that particular scenario was going to happen? So the one I'm going to focus on is this one here, the rendezvous with destiny. But you should do this for all four of them, right? So the rendezvous with destiny time zero is new political players, borrow a line from FDR. They talk about a new American revolution. We see, just a cascade of regulatory and social changes which aim to rewrite the social contract, at least in America and maybe in other parts of the world. So what would have to be true before that could be? Well, 2 months before that could be true, if our time zero is January 2021, you'd have to see elections with a change in incumbent party. You'd probably see specific legislation to do things like limit buybacks, provide additional worker protections, do something about healthcare, make it more difficult to pollute, in a reversal of policy. 3 months before, now we're started getting into near-in territory, you begin to see lawsuits that say gig workers are actually employees and need to be treated as such, right? And we're seeing that in California, for example. We start to see some cohesion in the progressive coalitions where people are actually pushing for the same policies rather than splintering off into 1,000 different directions. We start to see some people who have been historically very influential, see some of that influence no longer working as well as it was. economists talking about a K-shaped or Y-shaped recovery. And now, influential people loudly critiquing the existing system, action by labor and other stakeholders, popular support for government safety net programs on the increase, awareness that many essential workers don't make a living wage, and we're starting to see many of those things right now. So that would be a sequence of events that would lead you to this upper right-hand scenario. Now, you'd have a very different sequence of events if you were thinking one of the other scenarios. So you'd want to do that for all of those. So let me wrap up the formal part of this with this observation that when I first started in strategy, it was all about industries. It was all about industry analysis, and rank order of rating and R&D spend and stuff. And those of us studying innovation who were interested in we were interested in insides of corporations. We were interested in what individual decision makers were doing. And I think because of this condensation of competitive advantage, those two things have really started to come together. And even more than that, those two have now started to come together with digital. And so increasingly, these three are forming kind of the nexus of what I think one of the next kind of inflection points is going to be. It's this acceleration of digital into our world. So concluding thoughts, inflection points gradually, then suddenly. They don't happen instantly as a general rule. Stories are really important. It's how human beings make sense of anything, and especially about the future. Unfortunately, most of the data that we have to work with is lagging, which is sad. The strength of a signal inversely related to your ability to change it. And it's really not about prediction, it's about preparedness. And then finally, I think it is possible to identify early warnings. Bearing in mind the outcome measure, the thing you want to create is preparedness, not prediction. So if you are interested in, formally keeping up with me, I'm on all the usual social channels. I do a fireside chat each Friday, which you're welcome to join, where I invite sort of super interesting people to come and chat about what they're up to. And I have a YouTube channel as well, where we post all kinds of videos. And I do also publish a free monthly newsletter, which this year, my nicely crafted newsletter plan kind of blew up for this year. But this month is on team effectiveness. Next month, it's going to be a 1-year retrospective of the publication of my book. So that's how you can keep up with me. So let me stop there and see what you guys would like to do next.
Thank you. That was incredible.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think from here we'll, hopefully have some discussion. I know I have questions. I will hold off in case anyone else has questions. So if anyone does have questions, feel free to either chat them or unmute yourself and ask.
Yeah, Rita, thank you so much. That was a really fascinating discussion. I'm still trying to wrap my mind around everything that you presented to us.
I did kind of scooch through it pretty quickly, but I wanted to leave time to have a conversation.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's interesting to me, because I've been reading a lot lately about early warnings, scenario planning, and similar things like that. And I think the hardest thing for most of us is kind of those leading, not lagging, because we can all figure out kind of like the lagging, but how do you hone in on your leading indicators? What to you is like good practice for figuring out those leading indicators when you're working on something?
Yeah, I think what you want to be thinking about there is what's the outcome that you're concerned about, and then what would have to be true before that outcome could be true, and how would you know if that was the progress that you were making. So let me take an example because that might make it more clear. So when Satya Nadella came into Microsoft, which was I think in 2014, what he observed was that the firm's whole incentive structure was based about lagging indicators. So it was profitability, revenues, sales performance. And he also noticed that they missed like every major technological inflection point. They missed like 5 of them. They missed mobile, they missed cloud, they missed, it was just bad because they were so backward looking, right? And it wasn't that they weren't smart. It was that they weren't having practices that pulled the organization into the future rather than the past. So one of the things he did was he said, in the future, we're going to be platform agnostic. So we're going to embrace Linux, we're going to embrace whatever, because we're moving to a cloud-based business model, and you can't be a closed system on a cloud-based business model. Second thing, one of the things I'm going to care about the most is usage. So if we can get customers to use our offerings, the revenue and profits will flow. And before they can use our offerings, before they want to use our offerings, they have to love what we're doing. So one of his leading indicators is literally customer love. And I thought, that's so weird. But I happened to buy, of all things, a computer monitor from the Microsoft store, and they literally asked me in the follow-up email to that purchase, did it make me want to love Microsoft or something? With some wording like that, and I'm like looking at the screen going, Microsoft. But what he did to give teeth to this was, if you look at his executive team, half of them are being compensated now on the basis of what he calls performance measures, which are the traditional, how much revenue, sales, da 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 da. So he's not ignoring that, but the other half is about these, what he calls power metrics. So it's the leading indicators. So are you driving customer love? Are you creating conditions under which more usage can occur? Are you making this a pleasant place? Do you have empathy for customers? So those kinds of questions. So, if half your compensation is going to come from being concerned about the future of your organization, you're going to be a lot more interested than if it's all coming from backward looking stuff.
And it's interesting because he really embraced what we would consider qualitative measures, which sometimes it's hard to get those across to leadership. A lot of times they really want the crunchy numbers and quantitative metrics, and getting people to embrace qualitative is not always easy.
Oh, I know. So here's a great phrase when somebody behaves that way. Yes, it's statistically pristine, but strategically irrelevant.
Okay. Nice. Thank you.
Do you have any other questions? Well, I'll go ahead and jump in with mine then. So I'm wondering, when you do kind of the storytelling that you talk about, how do you weave in, or where do you weave in the recommendations that you want, the actions you want someone to take? How does that become part of the story, or is it separate?
Well, I think what you want to have is an overall story that you then tailor to the moment that you're in. So if you've got 30 seconds with a stakeholder in an elevator, obviously that's a different story than if you've got half an hour with someone to really go through it with them. For the short version, what I recommend is the traditional elevator speech, right? And the way that I frame it is it's based on some theories about how people need to be primed for change. So if you're going to see successful change, you need a dissatisfaction with the current state. You need to have some idea of how great the future state could be. And then you have to remove obstacles getting in between where we are to where we want to be in the future. So the way I like to talk about an elevator pitch is start with the dissatisfaction, then paint the vision, then think through, before you meet this person, like what could they do to help you? So casual conversation in an elevator. So Rita has the redesign of all your exec ed going to online, going out. And I'm like, oh, wow, it's been really, really challenging to get the faculty to embrace it. But I think we're really seeing some cracks, and we're going to make headway. And I think the vision is it's going to be even better once we learn how to do this blended thing. And what you could do to be helpful is, if you wouldn't mind coming to the next faculty meeting and sharing your thoughts on how urgently this is needed, that would be really super useful. Right? So just very clear, like, here's what's the problem, here's the signs of hope, and here's what you can do to help. And I think it's useful, if you think about your key stakeholders, to think about that stuff ahead of time, because I don't know about you, but when I get confronted with an unexpected opportunity or a challenge, I sit there with my mouth full of teeth. And then 12 hours later, I'm like, damn, why didn't I say, whatever it is. So as you're thinking about the future, a stakeholder map is really your friend. It's who's got a stake, what could they do to help, how could I mobilize them, and that, give it a little thought before you actually bump into those people.
Very helpful. I do have other questions, but if anyone else does, I'll pause.
Yes, I do. Hi, this is Alba McIntyre from Ohio State University, and thank you so much for this presentation. It's great. And thank you for coming to us and presenting your material. I have when you talk about strategy inflection point, when you talked about that, I immediately went through, of course, I worked for university, or have always worked for university. So I'm thinking of, we as universities, we already past the strategy inflection point regarding the COVID?
And it's going to be bifurcated depending on who you are and what your resources are. So
because I don't know if you know any in university that was prepared for this, for the COVID effects on higher education.
No, I don't know of many. There's a couple that I think prepared better than others. I mean, I think one of the ones that was very willing very early to say, you know, we're just not bringing students back on campus is Southern New Hampshire University. But, you know, out of their 135,000 students, something like 2,000 are on campus. So it's a much easier decision for them to make to not have students on campus than for many other schools, which are really dependent on that on-campus experience. No, I mean, I think if I look at my own institution and the others, we kind of went through the spring semester saying, okay, emergency action. Then over the summer, oh, it'll be done by Easter. Oh, it'll be done by July. Oh, it'll be done by, and it wasn't really till we got like to the end of July where at least I started to see schools really saying, you know, this, we need to have completely different protocols. And I think one of the good things, but also one of the unfortunate things is there's so little consensus and guidance. It's really the Wild West out there. I mean, some schools are, I think, doing a better job of getting ahead of it, and some are just sort of ignoring it, and some are kind of panicking around it. So I think it's very interesting to see the variation in schools. Couple of other things I would say is that, so following on this, a few things I think we can anticipate. And since you guys are thinking about the future, this is really worth sticking in your idea box. The first thing is that what the pandemic has done has revealed that for many students, and I'll use Clayton Christensen's word here, many of our traditional 18 to 22-year-old, that age group student, they're assuming the academics, right? They're taking those for granted. What they're coming for is the coming of age experience. You know, I want to root for the sports team, and I want to fall in love, and I want to have late night conversations. And so from a student point of view, the value of staring at a screen and listening to somebody drone on is about as great as watching YouTube videos. I mean, it's like that's the least value, right? And I think for a long time, I don't know about you guys, but many of my colleagues don't understand that. You know, they think it's, I'm the, you know, the sage on the stage imparting wisdom and knowledge to these hungry young minds. Well, of course, that's a piece of it, but it's not the biggest piece. So that's the first thing. So secondly, if you understand that, then what you're starting to see now is a ton of really creative solutions that are coming out as people are responding to this crisis with innovation. So was it ASU? I think it was ASU that started testing the water in the buildings and could pick up cases before they had the chance to really spread. So you got, that's a beautiful example of an early warning. So if you can isolate people that have infections early and you know, get them out of the mainstream, you can actually stop this thing in its tracks. I mean, it depends on human contact for transmission. Second fascinating new development has been that some students are taking matters into their own hands. And so what they're doing is they're creating these almost little communities that renting houses or apartments or renting successions of rooms where each person who joins, you know, has been tested, has quarantined, is okay. They sort of make a commitment not to intervene too much in a non-safe way with the outside world. They attend their classes online, and then offline, they've got this coming of age experience that they're creating for themselves, which is fascinating. So, you know, there was just a story about that in the paper. So I think what you'll start to see is a lot of really adaptive responses. Now, the other things that I think you're going to see are things that we in higher ed need to start paying attention to, which is the being on campus thing, right, that people will pay for, can be unbundled if people have alternatives, if people come up with creative alternatives. And so if I'm doing all my classes online, right, well, why wouldn't I do, you know, my marketing class with the best person, at Michigan? Why wouldn't I do my politics class with the best person at Harvard's Kennedy School? Because online unbundles the whole experience, right? And I mean, it's a bit like what happened to the music industry, right? Now you can buy just the songs you want. You don't have to buy the whole hairball. And so I think you'll start to see credentialing at a level below the level of the degree. We're already seeing Google trying to make an attempt at that they'll, if you can pass their 6-month boot camp test, they will give you a job. And it's a decent job. It's the kind of job, you would have had to have a college degree before to aspire to, and you don't anymore. So I think there's a whole lot of dynamics around this. What is a university? What does this mean? I think, unfortunately, a lot of schools with weak endowments or just really bad finances are going to find they have no choice but to shut down. I think we'll see a lot of merging, but I also think we'll see a lot of innovation coming out of it. And kind of depending on which side of it you're in, it could be great for you or it could be not so great. It's a real inflection point.
But I was thinking of even earlier timeline, maybe like 1 year ago. Was any university prepared for the effects of COVID? I don't think anybody was even thinking about there may be a shift on education in next year. So that's what I think you were talking about when you said if it's working, we tend to keep that strategy, right? And I think that's what COVID taught a lot of universities is things may change radically in a couple of weeks. And so we always have to be prepared or at least aware of the factors that may play an influence. That's where I think you mentioned doing the scenario planning and considering. But do you see this being used in universities around the country? An early warning system, for example?
I wouldn't be in a position to answer that because I only have my one as a reference and a few other colleagues I've talked to. The reality of this pandemic is nobody predicted this particular pandemic, but there have been very strong predictions about pandemics for years, going all the way back to Bill Gates' 2015 TED Talk. I mean,
correct.
And in the US, President Bush actually was worried enough about this that they put in place pandemic preparedness measures. And as of 2017, we had a set of health regulations that were going to go through OSHA that would have required hospitals to be prepared for something like this. So it wasn't that people didn't understand this was a possibility. It was that, in the short term, it's always easier to say, well, that's unlikely to happen. I've got resources that need to be put somewhere else. And that's a very common function. I have a friend who's in public health, and she said, the problem with my job is if I do it right, everybody says, well, you really, you like completely over exaggerated that because nothing happens, nothing bad happens, right? It takes until something really bad happens that you get to realize the value of public health.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Sure. And I see a hand raised from Anne-Marie. Anne-Marie, do you want to unmute if you have a question?
Sure. I'd like to talk about the leading indicators a little bit. You said that when you're looking at a leading indicator, you're looking at the outcome, and then you work backwards and look at what has to be true in order for you to get that specific outcome. So does that mean then that we are picking these indicators based on where we want to go, or what we identify as an indicator that we want to be true, and then work backwards and figure out how do we get there? So for example, switching directions with your team or developing additional programs for proposal support, whatever it may be, and then you look through the skill set that you need to get there. I just want to make sure I understood and got the whole premise of it.
Yeah, so a good reference for that question is my article, Discovery Driven Planning, or the book, Discovery Driven Growth. And the new book has a bit of a nod to that as well. So you got two kinds of early warnings, right? One kind is things that are really outside your control, but you want to be keeping an eye open on them. And the other are things that you want to make come true. You know? And so with discovery-driven planning, what you do is you start with the end in mind, and then you work backward and say, well, if that's where I want to be in 18 months, what would I have to put in place prior to that? Now, the reason it's important to think about at this juncture is right now we're all living in this world of incredibly high numbers of assumptions we need to make relative to knowledge that we have. And your job in a context like that is really creating, converting assumptions into knowledge. And you don't really want to take a lot of action until you've done some of that. So with a discovery-driven plan, what you do is you take your big monolithic plan and you break it down into pieces. And then when you get to each key checkpoint, you say, okay, let's look around, and has anything changed? You know, do we need to change direction? And then I have an acronym I call RACE. Do we redirect? Do we accelerate? Maybe we can go even faster. Do we just continue? Or maybe we need to exit. Maybe this course of action is proving to be fruitless and we just need to stop. So there's some resources that you can use, but the uber answer to your question is yes. If you want to do something different, those early warnings can really be helpful.
Thank you so much. I was really looking forward to this, and it did not disappoint.
Oh, good.
Well, if there aren't any other questions, I'll jump in with another one of mine. So I guess I'm thinking, you know, when you are at this inflection point, like how fast does action need to happen? And, you know, because it's hard, you know, to move an entire organization some other way. So how do you respond at this like timely manner to really capture the inflection point and truly respond to it strategically?
Yeah, a couple of observations I would make there is in an ideal world, you know, the entity or the part of your organization that's closest to the required information is the one that would be able to take action. Now, to make that happen in a typical university, it's like, I don't know about you guys, but because we're very siloed, right? I mean, everything's siloed from our functions to our academic disciplines to whatever. So one of the things that you want to be thinking about is, are there ways we could create horizontal flows of information across our organization? And a great reference on how other entities do this is in Stanley McChrystal's wonderful book, Team of Teams. In which he talks about, you know, the US military had all these incredibly gifted special forces like Navy SEALs, you know, and Green Berets and all those guys. And what they found was they were very, very loyal and had huge amounts of trust within their teams, but not so much across their teams. And I think the analogy is like to organizational silos. And so what they did, among many other things, is they invested in a daily, conceivably hour-long call. And all the people on the call did was they said, here's what I'm seeing, here's what I'm seeing, here's what I'm seeing. So that you kind of develop this collective consciousness of what was going on in the theater. And what I thought was so interesting about it was they deliberately designed it as a horizontal, you know, cross-silo, cross-team, cross-whatever platform, and then committed. I mean, he was on every single one of those calls as the most senior person. And it took a long time before people felt they could trust that process, but eventually they did. So if you think about that as a context that you've got in place, so there's an initial bit of work to get that in place. But once you got that in place, then, you know, my little, let's say, let's say we have a sudden uptick in credit card defaults, right? Once I know the context and I know the strategy and I understand where we're trying to get to, now my team that handles credit cards can go off and do, because they know what they're doing. And then they know they've got a forum to come back and say, here's the problem we had, here's what we did about it. And here's what we think we should try next, without having to worry about, oh geez, I need to get permission from 17 people before I can take action. So I think it's almost an orientation towards action, but you have to provide the context. And I think that's really important. Otherwise people are going to be afraid.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, so that's Team of Teams. I'll see if I can put it in the chat.
Thank you.
Terrific book.
And then one final kind of question that I had is just, right, so competitive intelligence in academia is kind of finding its path, and, you know, we're charting that, the people on this call. And so I'm kind of wondering, from your experience looking at competitive intelligence and strategic intelligence and insights across the board, where, you know, what are ways to grow competitive intelligence at institutions? How do we grow it for ourselves personally? You know, kind of just from your experience in doing this, where do you see things going? How do we get them there?
Sure. So I think, like with anything, as an educator, I would say probably learn what best practice is. So a couple of resources I can suggest there are anything by Amy Webb. And she has a fabulous organization called the Future Today Institute. And on her website, you will find all kinds of tools, techniques, downloadable maps, stuff like that. Just a huge amount of resources there. So I think I'd get familiar with that. The other thing that Amy just published is a sort of a guide to what she calls 11 macro trends that you can use to sort of connect the dots among various things. So I think Amy is just a fabulous resource. The other great resource is a guy, I think his name is Leonard Fuld, F-U-L-D. And he wrote one of the early, very definitive books on competitive intelligence and has a lot of just good general best practice. So, so I think the first thing is you just, you know, builds up some knowledge about what's kind of best practice out there. Then I think probably the next best step is to take a small project, because you don't want to take a boil the ocean kind of project as your first thing, but, you know, perhaps work through kind of what are we seeing in, I'll make this up, fraternities and sororities that could really signal a major shift in attitude, right? And therefore in governance, therefore in whatever, and just slice off a piece to think about first. I think groups like this one are really super interesting. I mean, how did you guys come together? It's a fascinating concept.
Well, I'll let Karen take that since she's the one that did it.
Well, basically, it kind of was an offshoot of some activities I was doing at ASU with some very basic reporting. And then I started learning about strategic and competitive intelligence and putting some of those methodologies into practice. And then there was, I think it was the NORDIP 2016 meeting. Are you familiar with the NORDIP organization? It's the National Organization of Research Development Professionals. So it's an academic organization for people working as primarily staff, working with faculty to help grow their activities, also working with leadership and so forth. Anyway, I went there to present what I was doing in competitive intelligence. Seemed to be very popular with a lot of the people in the audience. I made a lot of connections and we just started growing the group from there. And then at ASU, we grew our team from me to now Jamie and another person on our staff. So we have 3 of us. Yeah, just building a lot of connections with other people so we could do things like build out best practices and kind of establish what it is to do competitive intelligence in an academic environment. So yeah, it's great to be able to hear you talk about like Amy Webb or Fold, because those are things we've been following. So I feel like, oh, we're on the right path then.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, I mean, my own institution is what, you know, 250 plus, 270 plus years old. I mean, we've had a lot of opportunity to grow barnacles, you know. The other thing I think that's very interesting right now, just from the point of view of academia, is this question of what is the job to be done? And unfortunately, for a lot of potential students, we're not doing a great job at it. I mean, most of the students that start a 4-year degree don't complete. Or they certainly don't complete in 4 years. So, you know, somehow we've become this, Scott Galloway from NYU talks about, you know, education as an elite offer, you know, a luxury good, that's what he calls it. And given education's potential to transform lives, I think that's sad, you know, that's missing. So, you know, I do think there's an opportunity, the COVID crisis gives all of us an opportunity to think about, you know, what would we do differently in terms of design, right? So if you can have if you can have 10 kids form a study group in a very affordable apartment complex rather than having to pay, room and board fees, well, do we want to enable that or not? I mean, it's just a really strange new world. I mean, Clayton Christensen years ago predicted that what you'd start to see is the unbundling of the degree, that you'd start to see, professors developing their own brands, and then that independent of their institutions. And there are already some people who are like that. I think Scott Galloway's one, right? He runs a private evening course for MBAs, for business students, for which he charges privately $500 a pop, and he's got 1,000 people in that class. So, the numbers start to get really interesting if you've got that kind of reputation. I'm surprised that NYU isn't objecting, but I guess that's their issue, not mine.
It does seem like this is a very transformative time, and we will see a lot of changes coming out of this, in some ways forced upon us or maybe accelerated because of the virus and all of the other kind of domino effect on our life, social, economic, political, and other structures. So yeah, as you mentioned, people will have to adapt, right? So we'll have to see how that affects us.
Well, I'm interested in, one of the things I'm fascinated by is, the number of whole sectors of our economy that assume people are going to be comfortable in the company of strangers, and how long is it going to be before that assumption holds widely again? People talk about a vaccine as though it's a magic bullet, but I don't know about you, but if I'm not willing to take on undue risks if I don't have to, and I think it's going to be a long time when that's the prevailing norm. So what moves in its place? And I think it's kind of interesting. People talk about a K shape or a Y shape where, and this is going to be new because pieces of the economy are already back. They're already booming. They're doing really, really well. And pieces of the economy are really, really hurting. And so how are we going to sort of deal with that imbalance? Because a lot of people are getting left behind, even as a whole bunch of other people are really finding this is a great opportunity. So it's kind of interesting to speculate about that. Then I do think that some business models are just never going to be what they once were. I think, for example, this business of flying around the world and giving the same 45-minute speech 50 times a year, and that's how you make your living, I think that's dead. But what I'm seeing people interested in and willing to actually pay for is this kind of thing, right? Let's make sense of it. Let's see what you're hearing. What are you hearing? How do we connect the dots? How do you help us connect the dots? And how do we get smarter about what could come next? I think that kind of thing is now beginning to rise to the top of the agenda. So you're really seeing business models change. I do think this sort of, sure, I'll get on a plane and go to Chicago for that in-person meeting that's going to last 2 hours. I think people are really going to be rethinking that. Once we've done this for 6 months and it's sort of worked in some way, there's going to be a lot of pressure on people to minimize that kind of travel, to get smarter about how we do remote things. Once we've built up the skill and the knowledge base to do remote effectively, then it's very. You wonder how are we just going to throw all that overboard and go back to the way it was? I don't think so. I'll give you an example of something that I'm learning anyway. So I teach primarily in our executive education programs at Columbia. And one of the things I teach is a 3-day course called Women in Leadership. And it's really designed for women who are maybe 15 years into their career when organizations start to lose them, and for a whole host of reasons. But, when I run it in person, it's 3 days, it's intensive, there's a cocktail party, it's, drinking from a fire hose. And I thought, well, that's not going to work in a virtual context. Who's going to sit there and stare at a screen from 8:30 in the morning to 5 at night? It's just not going to happen. And then I thought about our population, and I said, a lot of these people are working. They may have kids at home. They may have other responsibilities. Fitting in a whole chunk of coursework is going to be really hard. On the other hand, what better time to invest in your own development? So what I did was I took the course and broke it up into segments that run from 11 o'clock in the morning to 3 in the afternoon with a break in between for lunch or errands or whatever. So it's basically like 3 chunks of content, and made it for 2 days a week and spread it over 4 weeks. And the reviews were unbelievable. I mean, it reviewed better than our in-person course. And we had 46 people in it, which is about double the size that we could normally accommodate in the in-person course. So one example of the kind of change I think we'll see is even when we go back to in-person instruction, I could see us running this format. It's a whole different segment, right? So, you know, it's people that don't have the budget or the time to come to New York. I mean, we had a whole group from Singapore take it, which was great. I was very worried about the bonding. I was worried about, you know, will they get the networking? Will they get, and they're on like a WhatsApp, offering job recommendations to each other and posting articles around it. And we've had 2 pieces come out in Forbes already talking about what a magical learning experience it was. So, you know, I think we make these assumptions that what we're creating now is not as good. And what we may find is there are completely different segments that these new formats will appeal to, and that it actually opens up opportunity. So that's just from my personal experience. That was July. That's how I spent my July redesigning this course.
Well, that's incredible. I think, I hope we continue to see that these new offerings are, you know, in some ways better or as impactful.
Well, I think it's a different segment, right? I mean, it's like our own students. There are always going to be some that, you know, nothing's going to be as good as being there and whatever. But then there are others for whom the primary thing is complete, you know, like Paul LeBlanc from Southern New Hampshire University says, you know, these are people who've had about all the coming of age they can handle, you know, and what they need is to get a degree so they can get on with their lives. And that's a totally different need that people have.
Well, are there any other questions? Any final thoughts? This was a great presentation. I just want to thank you so much. This is really good. And I know so many people were excited, and as Anne Marie said, did not disappoint. This was incredible.
Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to meet you all. And best of luck with your next series. That'll be fun.
Thank you. And yeah, just for everyone on the call, Alba has shared in the chat, and Rita has shared in the chat as well, all of the books we discussed. And so happy reading, I guess.
Happy reading. Indeed, indeed. Well, enjoy. Welcome to September.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.